Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 20 on warfare through time. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we're moving into the fourth and the last, chronologically that is, the last section of the course, the modern era, round about 1900 to the present day, the modern world if you like. Reminds me of my favourite band of all time, The Jam, 1977, an album there. This is the modern world. Classic. This is the modern world. Well, what was warfare like in the modern world? Hopefully, this series of videos we're going to look at will give you the answer to that and will help you if it comes up in your exam. Now, as ever, we'll be looking at change and continuity. Now, let's start with, as usual, the nature of warfare, and we'll concentrate on the armies. Now, size of army. Let's start with a little bit of continuity. Throughout the 1900s, the 20th century, Britain retained quite a small regular army known as a standing army. Now, Britain had had a standing army from roughly 1700 onwards. In peacetime, through the 1900s, it remained there quite small. 1900, 250,000. By the 1920s, 1930s, about 200,000 soldiers. By the 1960s, 170,000. So there is a small, regular standing army. Continuity. But at the same time, there were still some big changes. Now let's have a look. World War I. Remember that small standing army, roughly 250,000? World War I, 3.5 million. World War II, 3.3 million. And from the 1960s onwards, a slow, gradual decline in the number from about 160, 170,000 down to today, where there's about 82,000. So there are three changes. Spikes in World War I, spike in World War II, slow gradual reduction in the numbers as we move through the latter part of the 20th century. Now, you might ask yourself, why? Why were there so many changes? Well, it's to do with warfare itself changing, as I'll show you over this series of videos. So with the warfare changing, so the army had to change and adapt, and they didn't need as many soldiers due to the introduction of new weapons, new technology, which we'll explain in the next few videos. Now, so that's size of the army. What about composition of the army? How was the army made up? Well, again, we can look at some changes. In 1900, the start of the 20th century, Infantry was about 65% of the army, 1900. Today, down to 25%. So there's a big change. Reduction in size of the infantry. There is some continuity because it's the infantry which are still most likely to do the actual fighting, just the way it had been back in history. So there's a bit of continuity, but there's a lot of change. Because war is far more complex. They don't need quite as many soldiers' boots on the ground. So therefore, the reduction in infantry is one of the changes. Now what about cavalry? Go back to 1900, 10% of the army, of the soldiers, would be men on horseback. Cavalry, they'd had an important role throughout history. Well, what is it now? Cavalry, 10% in 1900. Well, if you're talking the traditional sword and horse, battlefield charge, well, cavalry is now 0%. So there's a change. But we can be a little bit more nuanced about it, ladies and gentlemen, because in a way, horses, where they used to do scouting and raiding, that was the later job of the cavalry, when charges begin to decline, the role of horses in a way has been done by tanks protecting the infantry. Nowadays, tanks protect the infantry. So if you're saying, look, they're not cavalry, but they are still doing the role of protecting infantry, then we still have about 10% of the forces are tanks. So that's similar in a way to the 10% of the cavalry in 1900. What about artillery? Back in 1900, 20%. Nowadays, reduced to about 10%. Because ground artillery, firing the shells from the ground, nowadays we have newer technology and we have different types of artillery. For example, tanks, aircraft, satellite guided missiles. So again, there is a change there. A reduction in the number of artillery, but an increase in the different range of artillery. And the final one, possibly the largest change of all in the composition of the army, and it's to do with specialist troops. Go back to 1900. Specialist troops, what did we mean? Well, medical, admin, only 5%. But nowadays, it's a huge change. Specialist troops make up maybe 50-55% of the army. What do we mean by specialist troops today? Well, I'll list them and then I'll explain later in this video. Here's some ideas. Royal Engineers, 10%, building bridges. The REME, R-E-M-E, motor engineers, looking after vehicles and equipment. Logistics Corps, 15%. Army Medical Corps, 3%. So there's a difference, there's a huge increase in the number of specialist troops, which I'll explain in a minute or two. So there we see some of the differences in the composition, the makeup, the types of the soldiers involved in our army today. Before we get to the specialist troops, I'll just have a look at two changes in the structure of the army, how the overall army is set up. First one, back over 100 years, 1908. In the aftermath of the Boer War, 1899-1902, the British Army did not really particularly perform that well in the Boer War. And there was a variety of reasons for that. Attitudes in society. People were critical, saying, look, we're Britain. We've got a huge empire. We're a very important country in the world. Therefore, our army should not be underperforming. So afterwards, society said, let's ask some questions. The general public wanted to know why and what people were going to do about it. Step forward, a man called Lord Haldane, Richard Haldane, H-A-L-D-A-N-E, Lord Haldane, Secretary of State for War. And he was given the responsibility by the government to investigate and find out why Britain hadn't done well and what they were going to do about it. And his response to the poor performance in the Boer War was what's known as Haldane's reforms. And he basically divided the army into two groups. Group number one, the regular professional standing army, permanently there to defend our country, either here at home or abroad. And the total, round about 150,000 in Lord Haldane's plan, 1908. The second group, a territorial army, part-time reserve army, there to reinforce the professional army in times of emergencies. And in 1920, this reserve was renamed the Territorial Army, the TAs, and there were about 270,000 soldiers there. So that's the first structural change, Lord Haldane's reforms, 1908. The second one, move right up to date, ladies and gentlemen, because it is still ongoing now, and it's called Army 2020. Gives you a clue. Again, in a way, it's similar to Haldane, because they keep the two different groups. Number one, a regular army of 82,000, and number two, an army reserve. Just a few years ago, 2013, the army reserve was renamed from the old territorial army, became the army reserve, and there's about 30,000 part-time soldiers there. So it's continued with Haldane's split of a regular and a part-time army, but the change is the vast reduction in numbers. Why? Because of technology and new weaponry. They don't need quite as many soldiers to actually do the job. So that's changes in the structure of the army. Now, earlier in the video I mentioned specialist troops. That's one of the key changes, and I'll just run you through some examples for the rest of the video. Let's start with logistics. Logical, Mr. Spock. Live long and prosper. Star Trek fans will know exactly what I mean. Now, Mr. Spock was into his logic, but we're talking logistics. What is a logistics soldier? What do they do? Have you got any ideas? Star Trek bonus points if you said they work in transporting the troops, transporting the food, supplies, weapons, ammunition, organising the postal service, transferring and moving sick soldiers, wounded soldiers. That's their job. Things going on behind the scenes which allow the soldiers to do their job on the front line. Now, before 1900, the logistics, they were very poor. The organisation was poor. Go back to the 1790s, and that job, it was the job of the actual army commander to go and sort out the food. And he'd either do it by raids on enemies, or requisitioning of friendly civilians, or involving contractors, but it was all very slapdash and disorganised. 1790s, introduction of something called the Royal Wagoners. Wagoners as in wagons. And they were in charge of army transport, the Army Transport Corps. But they only existed in wartime. They were disbanded in peacetime. But it was the first step. As I said, 1854 to 1856. Look back to other videos. The Crimean War, Battle of Balaclava, if you remember. Previous video, I mentioned poor supplies, poor resources, poor weapons by Lord Raglan. Check it out. So they said, in the Crimean War, look, we've got to try and do something about it. It showed the problems here. So they set up something called the Military Train, 1855. That was renamed the Army Service Corps, 1888. Go back and have a look at video 17 to refresh your memory on that. So they're beginning before 1900 to sort out logistics, but there's still a lot to do. Then, of course, we get World War I, a huge conflict. I'll deal with it more in the next few videos. Now, the Army Service Corps faced problems on a huge scale. To give you an example of that, in 1914, they're in charge of bringing food for the soldiers, food for the animals, forage, also the petrol for all the new vehicles. 1914, start of World War I, they're supplying 120,000 men, 50,000 horses, 1,000 motor vehicles. That's a big job. But by the end of World War I, ladies and gentlemen, 1918, the Army Service Corps is supplying 3 million men, 500,000 horses and 90,000 vehicles. It's a huge increase. It was a very big task. Can you see that the scale has changed? By 1918, the Army Service Corps has been renamed the Royal Army Service Corps. 300,000 men, that's 10% of the army, were in charge, had the task of doing the planning, the driving, railways, moving the stuff for the rest of the army. That was a huge change. And then, 20 years later, World War II, even more demanding. Take D-Day, 6th of June 1944, when the British, American and other forces landed on the beaches in Normandy to push back the Nazis. Well, they had to plan for, just one day, 4,300 ships, 130,000 men to be landed, 20,000 vehicles to be landed, under fire in one day. It involved huge planning, massive changes. Logistics is becoming a very, very important part of modern warfare. So they had to have more people doing that job. And that has continued. 1993, so bringing it more modern, the RASC, Royal Army Service Corps, and other logistic groups became the Royal Logistic Corps. 15% of the army involved in that important task. 2003, bringing it into our century today, they were involved in planning the invasion of Iraq. 45,000 troops and supplies transported over 3,000 kilometres in 73 ships, 1,200 flights. Huge changes. The logistics corps became far more important as technology, transport, communications, weapons all changed. The development of specialist troops, the logistic corps. But there's one other we need to have a look at. Bomb disposal, or to give it its modern term, explosive ordnance disposal. I'll refer to it as EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, bomb disposal. Now, it didn't really start until World War II, 1940, when 25 bomb disposal units were set up at the start of the year, 1940. By the end of the year, there were 109. That showed how much they were needed, and their jobs to make bombs safe, both during the war and also after the war. Then, of course, as time moves on, other types of bombs are laid. We get landmines, we get IEDs, improvised explosive devices. 1972, a soldier called Miller, he develops a remote-controlled robot which help to dispose of, disarm the bombs, or sometimes blow them up. 1972, the use of robots to help. Technology is introducing change. Now we have far more complex, high-tech equipment. We have something called a Dragon Runner, which can be assembled. You can carry it on your back and then put it together and it will help. It will only help though. There are still some very brave people. And in 2015, in the Army of today, we have 2,000 EOD people, explosive ordnance disposal officers, 2,000, helped by 300 sniffer dogs, all aimed at trying to create safety from this newer, more technological threat of bombs, landmines and IEDs. Change. So we can see in this modern world, the army has had to adapt. The army has had to change, as I've tried to show you in this video. No more cavalry on horseback with swords. No, no, no. The old weapons have gone, but they've been replaced by new weapons. And that's what we'll look at in the next few videos. What happened with the weapons in the modern world? Have a look and find out. As ever, I hope it's been useful. This is the modern world, the jam, my favourite. All the best now. See you soon.